Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you. A very, very warm welcome to all our panelists who joined in and our audience members. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining in. Welcome to this webinar series, which is being organized by CSDR and CAS, which is on Europe's defense divide, probing the fault lines. We have a very stellar panel, and I will not take up much time, and I'll begin with quick introductions. First, we have Ms. Alicia Palmer, who is currently working as a research officer at the India office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. Welcome, Ms. Palmer. We have Ambassador Rakesh Sood, who has served as India's first ambassador and permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, and later as ambassador to Afghanistan, Nepal, and France. After retiring in 2013, Ambassador Sood was special envoy of the Prime Minister for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation till May 2014. He's also a distinguished fellow at CSDR. A very warm welcome to you, Ambassador Sood. We have with us Dr. Ulrich Speck, who is an independent foreign policy analyst based in Heidelberg. He writes a weekly geopolitical column for a Swiss newspaper and is a member of the DGAP, Zeitenwende Action Group. Dr. Speck has been a fellow at the GMF in Berlin, the Transatlantic Academy in Washington, D.C., Carnegie Europe, and Elcano in Brussels, and has worked for Radio Free Europe in Prague. Thank you so much for joining, Dr. Speck. We have also with us Dr. Wojciech Lorenz, who is the coordinator of the International Security Program at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. He is the author of the book Deterrence, Strategy, and Politics, and his research areas are NATO, nuclear and conventional deterrence, and Polish security policy. He was a former journalist at the Polish radio, the Polish BBC section in London, and was a civilian specialist at the Polish military contingent in Afghanistan, and coordinator of the research project on the protection of Ukraine's critical infrastructure against cyber attacks. Welcome, Dr. Lorenz. We also have with us Ms. Velina Chakarova, who is an expert in the field of geopolitics with over 20 years of professional experience and academic background in the field of security and defense. She is the founder of FACE, for a Conscious Experience EU. She is the former director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy in Vienna, Austria. She's currently serving as an instructor at the Real World Risk Institute, a member of the Strategic and Security Policy Advisory Board of the Science Commission at the Austrian Federal Ministry of Defense. Welcome, Ms. Villi.
Thank you very much.
Finally, we have with us also Mr. Linus. Thank you so much. We have Mr. Linus Kojala, who is the director of the Eastern Europe Studies Center, which is a think tank in Lithuania, and a lecturer at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University. He's currently serving as an associate at the Negotiation Task Force Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, Harvard University. He was a Baltic Sea Fellow in FBRI's Eurasia program in 2020. So with that, I again extend a very warm welcome to our panelists, and I would now hand it over to Ms. Palmer for introducing CAS and for her remarks. Thank you so much for joining.
Am I audible? Yes. Thank you so much, Mrs. Saha, for the introduction, and a very warm welcome to all. At the outset, I would like to thank CSDR and Professor Happymon Jacob for hosting this webinar series with us, the India office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and for shedding light on the highly important yet often underrepresented viewpoints in history of the countries between Moscow and Berlin. Today marks the first session of the webinar series, and I'm delighted that it assembles such renowned panelists from India, Central and Eastern Europe. It is of high relevance that the understanding of Europe's current security discourse gets strengthened by exchanging viewpoints, particularly in the Indian context. And as a German foundation based in India, we have noticed a couple of times that the comprehension or assessment of the war against the Ukraine is closely related to the awareness of the geographical sphere and history of its neighboring countries. Henceforth, without wishing to preempt the topic, but as a foundation which carries the legacy of the first German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, allow me to elaborate on 3 major points of his foresightful stance on the strategic autonomy in Europe. So first of all, Adenauer was very that the Russians, he was very of the Russians, and he was of the perception that Moscow posed the highest security threat to Germany. Second, Adenauer treasured the US as our partner and ally, and Germany has since then welcomed each and every arrival of US soldiers. So evidently, he was also aware of the fact that the US cannot serve as the only security provider in Europe, and hence that Europeans have to become more proactive. In his tenure, the rearmament and the rebuilding of the German armed forces was incepted from 1955 onwards against a large resistance in the society. And thirdly, if Adenauer was still alive today, he would most probably certify grand errors in the German Russia policy of the last 10 years. Further, he would continue to state that the efforts were running low in the coordination with the Central and Eastern European partners. And also he would welcome that the German Minister of Defense is currently implementing the significant and permanent stationing of German Bundeswehr troops in Lithuania. And having been a close friend to France and de Gaulle, he would advise Emmanuel Macron on the premise that a mere call for strategic autonomy is not sufficient unless you suit the action to the word. And the war against Ukraine could have been the ideal momentum for France to assume a leading role in Europe. While it is undisputed that France significantly supports Ukraine, it is yet playing in the middle field. Having said all this, ladies and gentlemen, undoubtedly, this war would be lost for Ukraine already a long time ago if it had not been for the great assistance by the US. Hence, we can be highly grateful for it, yet should not take it for granted. With this in mind, let us use this opportune momentum to strengthen not only the understanding, but also the ties between our countries. Thank you all.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Ms. Palmer. I would like to hand it over to Ambassador Sood. Please, if you could continue with the discussions.
Thank you, Rushali. I think we heard some very interesting comments, and the title is actually fascinating. And normally, most discussions on Ukraine talk about who's winning, who's losing, where is the counteroffensive going, and things like that. But the title that we have, Europe's Defense Divide, Probing the Fault Lines, and I would say let's put a question mark at the end, because we have to look for those fault lines. Where do they exist? And some of the questions that have been posed, including in opening remarks by Ms. Palmer, are absolutely to the point. You know, if we take a historical perspective, 20th century was the century of wars in Europe. And after World War II, there was a sense that perhaps Europe was moving towards a post-sovereignty Europe, from the EEC to the European Community to the European Union, the gradual expansion. The general sense was that Europe was now a continent which was moving beyond sovereignty. There was a notion of shared sovereignty and all the rest of it. And now, at the beginning of the 21st century, the first war that we see, which is already having global implications, is taking place in Europe. And that has, I would say, most of all shocked the Europeans. And that is why I think that the kind of panel that we have today is such an absolutely wonderful panel to explore this. Because even though the war that is taking place is the war in Ukraine, but then all of Europe is involved because NATO is involved. It may not have soldiers on the ground, but it is emotionally invested in 8 to 9 million refugees have come out of Ukraine and they are settled in, or they have found refuge in, and very welcoming kind of refuge, I dare say. At the same time, questions that were being asked, President Macron's famous interview where he said NATO is brain dead a few years ago, has now been replaced by a whole new re-energized NATO. And in no other instance have we seen. At last count, I found that there was about $100 billion of military assistance that had already been provided to Ukraine. Out of this, about 48 billion had come from the United States. That is a huge, in a year and a half, if we look at it, that's an enormously large amount of military assistance. If we combine that with the question of strategic autonomy for Europe, it raises a question. It raises two questions, I would say. One, that does this strategic autonomy means loosening of ties with the United States or not? And number two, does this strategic autonomy have a precondition of a complete convergence of views within Europe? And here, if we look at how NATO has expanded with the end of the Cold War, we find that, if you just look at this, there is an enormous, it's almost a doubling of NATO from 15 countries at the end of the Cold War. I mean, I'm not counting East Germany merged and there was a unified Germany, so that is one. But then after that, we saw waves of expansion. In 1999, we saw Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. In 2004, we saw 7 more countries, the 3 Baltic republics, and Romania, Bulgaria, Slovakia, and Slovenia. In 2009, we saw Albania and Croatia. In 2017, we saw Montenegro. In 2020, we saw North Macedonia. And in all this process, we have seen how closely it has moved, creating concerns for Moscow. And then, of course, Ukraine and Georgia at the Bucharest NATO summit, where they were not admitted, but a kind of a green light was given to their eventual admission in NATO. Now, if you overlap this, now I frankly, I'm not technically that savvy, but if I take this and I overlap this with the expansion that has taken place also over a similar period of time, you can once again see that just as there has been the military footprint of the West that has grown, so has the political economic footprint of West, as it were. The first expansion of the European Union in 1995 took place with Austria, Sweden, and Finland, countries that through the Cold War practiced their own version of neutrality. In 2004, just as in 2004, you saw that massive expansion of NATO with 7 new members. You see those 7 members plus Cyprus and Malta and so on. You see 10 new members joining the European Union. And in 2007, you see Bulgaria and Romania. And then in 2013, you see Croatia joining. Now, of course, we have the Brexit issue, but UK is otherwise very closely tied through NATO and things like that. So I think if you look at the overlapping, if you can actually visualize an overlapping of expansions of both the economic, political, military footprints, then there is something that has been happening there, which has now created its own backlash, as it were. And that is why there is this talk of, are there fault lines in Europe? Is there a difference of views between Central and East European countries compared to West European countries? Or as some commentators have said, between old Europe and new Europe? What kind of a future does NATO have? Today we are saying that NATO is re-energized, but NATO, after all, is built around US hegemony. There is no two ways about it. That is how NATO came into existence in 1949. And if we are looking at European autonomy, then are there going to be two equal players in NATO, namely Europe and United States? And that would be a new thing, as it were. So I think all of these are questions which we can perhaps reflect on. And as I said, I am really looking forward to this conversation because we have such a wonderful panel. Now, I understand that Mr. Kojala will be obliged to leave us. He won't be able to stay for the full duration. So perhaps I would like to request Mr. Kojala first to take the floor. Over to you, Mr. Kojala.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Thank you for the organizers. It's an honor to be in such a distinguished panel and obviously to discuss an important issue. I'd like to start off by saying that from our perspective, Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine is an existential threat, not only because of the linkages of the region to Ukraine, cultural, social, economic, but also because we think that if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine, if Russia is not pushed out from the sovereign territory of Ukraine, then there is a high risk that this aggression could reach other countries as well, possibly Moldova, which was obviously discussed early on after the full-scale invasion started, but also the Baltic states. So this is an existential issue for us all. But I'll like to ask maybe 3 questions or pose 3 dilemmas before giving my approach on how I would tackle some of the issues that we're facing. So first of all, we have to admit that we are facing a situation where the US is reconsidering its stance. And when you read US defense strategy documents, and that includes multiple recent administrations, not only the last one, you can clearly see and read that the US would like to see Europe taking up more responsibility for its security, because obviously, even during war in Ukraine, the US clearly states that China is the long-term strategic priority. Russia is an acute threat, but in the end, it's China that's going to take up most of the US focus and also resources. And that's why some very smart people like Andrew Mikta are asking a question whether the US is talking about burden sharing with Europe or burden shifting with European countries, meaning that the US role would diminish in the future, and that would obviously pose a lot of dilemmas for European decision makers. So it's not necessarily happening today, and the scale of it might differ, but we have to consider what would be the US role in the future. Second dilemma that we have to admit is that we are not ready in Europe. There are a lot of statistical data proving that most of European countries, including the big ones, would run out of ammunition facing such an intensity warfare as in Ukraine in days, not even weeks. So we were not ready for this kind of war. We were not ready to face the consequences of it. And even though the ammunition production lines and many other steps were taken, I mean, the ammunition production lines have been increasing, but still we are far from what we should be aiming at in order to have Europe that's capable of defending itself, with the US playing a significant role still. And obviously that's linked to my third question. We know that only a third of NATO countries spend at least 2% of GDP, which is the recommended target of spending on defense per year. Only a third of the countries have reached this, and it's going to be difficult for many countries at NATO to reach this type of this level of spending in the near future. Some of them are quite openly stating that they are not going to be at 2% in the next couple of years or so. And obviously, without increased spending, which would need to compensate first on the underspending that happened for many years, and only then that would lead to increased defensive capabilities. Well, that's a major issue. So these are the dilemmas. There are multiple other dilemmas, obviously, that we're facing, but these are the dilemmas that we're facing in terms of European defense capabilities. What needs to be done? First of all, and we've been telling that for years, we need to cooperate more. Only around 18% of European defense purchases are collaborative, which means that in most of the cases, we're still competing against one another rather than seeking the most effective solutions. And that includes, also countries that are relatively small. The Baltic states are not necessarily, the best examples of cooperating in terms of defense purchases, even though there are some examples of this. And that means that our forces are not that well integrated, even though we are facing obviously similar challenges in terms of our neighborhood and in terms of the lack of capabilities that small countries will always have as an issue. Second thing that needs to be done is obviously to include the European Union in this. So previously, I think EU's and NATO relationship was rather shallow. They were based, and they're still based, obviously, in Brussels, but not necessarily cooperative in many of the areas of common interest. I think that has been changing recently, at least on a political level for sure, but also on a practical level. And I think we see that in the Baltics as one of the ways forward, because an issue that we are facing is that there are lack of interlinkages with Poland still. The infrastructure is not there. It's being built, but it's not there yet. Highways, railways. And that's even worse with some of our northern neighbors. For instance, it's quite difficult to reach Riga by car. Even today, the roads are not the best ones. And obviously that has military implications as well. And we do not have the railroad that connects the Baltic capitals as well. So this is what should be done using EU's strengths, which is obviously funding, infrastructure development, and capabilities to make those projects work in practice. It's not easy, but it combines or adds to the effort of NATO to increase or to ensure the defensive capabilities of the Baltic states. So EU adds up to NATO rather than competes against NATO, which was the narrative a couple of years ago when we talked whether Europe should have an army that would maybe make US troops in Europe less needed. Third one, we need to see big countries taking up leadership. And I think Germany is actually a good example. It was mentioned already during the introductory remarks that Germany is increasing its presence in Lithuania. Recently, Germany promised to station a brigade of its troops to Lithuania on a permanent basis, which was a huge political step, of course. It's not implemented yet, and it's going to be a complicated task to do, because of course it means a lot of investment will have to be provided by the host country, Lithuania, building up the infrastructure, but also Germany will need to increase its troop levels, because at the moment, obviously, Germany doesn't have enough. So I think these developments are very reassuring or positive, because if the big countries will not take up more responsibility for European defense, then of course, smaller countries will not be capable of filling all the gaps in. And obviously, we are looking at Poland as well, which is an enormously important player and currently spending the most at NATO in terms of GDP. So this is a good example to follow. And finally, maintaining strong transatlantic links. I think we don't see a way of making Europe sufficient without the US role, even again, if we consider how it's going to change in the future. So this transatlantic linkage will be essential for the future. And unfortunately, the full-scale invasion of Russia proved how indispensable US leadership is. But of course, this leadership also has to touch upon the future of Ukraine. And if there will be gray zones on the map of Europe after this stage of war of aggression, if we'll speak about countries that are not aligned with NATO and standing in between Russia and NATO, will not make Europe stable and secure. So we have to face this dilemma honestly and candidly. It's not a dilemma that has an easy solution, but we cannot avoid it. And I think Vilnius summit proved that we are moving in the right direction, but the steps are maybe a bit too slow. So that's it from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think that was very compact, but raises a certain number of questions, and I myself have noted a couple. But let me now move on to our second speaker, Ms. Velina Chakarova. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Ambassador. I will just take on from where Linus just stopped, because the topic is obviously very comprehensive. will present several key theses on my side. I do not represent an official Austrian position, but my personal geopolitical assessment. First and foremost, let me start with the downside. Of course, we have to be very realistic about what happened and where we stood and where we are standing. Before then, I will move also to the upside of what's happening. And the downside is that first and foremost, on the 24th of February, I think the whole last year, the whole topic of the strategic autonomy has crumbled down. So for me personally, I think this topic of European strategic autonomy has absolutely ceased to exist, because as it was pointed out, if it had not been for the United States to immediately jump on and support Ukraine militarily, if Ukraine had to rely on European support, let's say in the first critical phase, well, we all know the answer to this question, and that is that Ukraine would have probably capitulated. So first and foremost, the whole thing about strategic autonomy, I think, is an artificial construct, as many that we Europeans like to talk about in specific bubbles of think tankers, security experts, bureaucrats in the capitals and in Brussels. That's my personal 2 cents on that matter. Second important point is that NATO, being this kind of institutional reminiscence from the Cold War, has finally emerged as, in fact, the key institutional player in terms of security and defense, not only because of Russia, but in the long run because of China. It is the only institution that has the know-how how to deal with the Communist Party. And as already pointed out by my speaker, I mean, obviously, also an institution guided and led by the United States, first and foremost. This is the institution that is equipped to deal with the biggest challenge of this century, which is not Russia, but it's in fact the systemic rivalry between the United States and China. And everything is centered around, so everything is derived from that. So NATO as an organization has not only survived all the prognoses of the last 30 years of being doomed, as you also, Ambassador, pointed out, with the brain dead NATO, but in fact has now become so relevant to the point that even the Russian president gave it a new meaning with having new members. Sweden will join NATO sooner or later. It's just a matter of time, which have been neutral for the last at least 70, and in the other case, more than 200 years. So you can imagine what it means in terms of mindset shift for these societies to decide and to push their politicians, in fact, to turn these 2 countries, Finland and Sweden, from neutral and from, alliance-free to move towards NATO. And here, this is the next important geopolitical trend that is not so much anticipated in every single capital. And here in Austria, I struggle to convey this message to political decision makers, is that there's going to be a significant push for more institutional cooperation between the European Union and NATO, because there won't be strategic autonomy, but there will be a very much strengthened European pillar within NATO. So this is going to be the way forward, by in fact strengthening the European pillar within NATO. And in order to avoid any worst case scenarios in the future, when we may see political shift in Washington, let's say Trump 2.0, one way how to avoid this scenario is to have more institutional cooperation between NATO and the European Union, so as to prevent actually, let's say, what happened with the first Trump administration, namely that NATO fell victim, as many other organizations, to this kind of bilateral track of diplomacy and realpolitik. And that obviously means that we are going to see significant power shifts within Europe, when it comes to also strengthening the European pillar of NATO, when it comes to erecting the new and strengthening the new eastern flank, which is going to be the new Iron Curtain of this Cold War 2.0 scenario in which we are actually living, but the West, and especially here in Europe, political decision makers obviously try to avoid the conversation about it. So we are going to have a new Iron Curtain. Obviously, Ukraine is going to be part of our Euro-Atlantic community. And along this eastern flank, from the Arctic and the Scandinavian, the Baltic Sea, Barents Sea, so you move towards Eastern Europe, and then you move towards the Black Sea, South Caucasus, Mediterranean. We are going to have a new kind of really significant power reshuffle, and obviously also significant bifurcation. So now here, of course, the next important point is where Europe stands in this Cold War, because this Cold War is not going to be about, as I said, Russia first and foremost. Now, obviously, of course, in the short term, we need to deal with the questions about our approach to Russia. I agree with that. And we have, I think, still no strategic, this is my personal assessment. Like I said, I'm still focusing on the downside. I argue that we in Europe haven't still agreed on the strategic consensus that Ukraine has to win the war by reinstalling its territorial integrity as per 1991. I think that this has to be the ultimate goal for us as a collective player. That means European institutions and European member states and capitals. We will hear different kind of announcements from the different capitals, depending on the geographic proximity, in terms of what exactly this ultimate goal should be. But I think that by stating clearly what our ultimate goal in this war is, I think that this will move us forward. Also in terms of a sense of urgency, I still don't see this sense of urgency in many of the capitals, including the one I'm actually based, where people still have the mindset of peace times. The word war is in fact often even not allowed to be mentioned in public space, in terms of that the war is only being conducted on Ukrainian soil, but it is not a war that is in fact also being conducted against Europe. So it's not, as my Bulgarian fellow Ivan Krastev, who is also based in Vienna, claiming it's not just a war in Europe, but it's also a war against Europe. And here what I argue, this is my assessment, is that on the 24th of February last year, Russia has also launched intentionally, deliberately, and with a long-term oriented calculus, a non-kinetic warfare against the European liberal order, against the European economic model, and obviously against the European security architecture. Deliberately and purposely, with the mindset that obviously the security architecture, this economic model, and also this kind of, package hasn't worked for the Russian interests. And by doing so, of course, the most direct goal was and remains the subjugation of Ukraine. But there are more invisible goals added to that, namely the goal, as I said, to install a new kind of equilibrium of power on the old continent, if you like, something similar to the 19th century chaos and concept of powers, where Russia would be dealing easily with those European states that are more Russian friendly or have more dependencies that they haven't diversified away from. But at the very same time, it is, I argue, a very much kind of approach which should position Russia at the pole, let's say at the pole position in the upcoming systemic rivalry. So by subjugating Ukraine, by destroying the security architecture, the economic model, and the liberal order, Russia would be able to position itself no longer as this systemic player and as this superpower as in the Cold War, but obviously as a critical wildcard, as a game changer in the systemic rivalry between the United States and China. So this is now the kind of situation we are. Let's talk a little bit about the upside. The upside of this equation is, in my view, that it was not so much the mindset and the understanding of the realities in the political elites, at least in most of them, because if you're sitting in a Baltic state or in Poland, you will have very, very clear understanding of what's going on. But it was the reality itself that punched politicians in the face and presented them with impossible, let's say, decisions, which brought us now 18 months later to the point that, as we speak, for the very first time, for instance, the European Union and the member states have overtaken the United States in terms of aid, financial and long, short-term financial aid, and also military aid to Ukraine. So we are catching up. We are collectively actually moving in a direction where there is no return in terms of the whole, ambitious goals how to support Ukraine. It is a whatever it takes approach. To remember Draghi's approach from a different crisis, namely the Greek debt crisis. So in a sense, there is no return. It is collective, and that means that right now, Central Eastern European members have also a say, and they have really shifted a lot of this politics. And the upside is obviously that it will create an absolute new power equation. And this power equation will open new opportunities for Europe. This is my last sentence. And that is that in terms of competition over, and it was mentioned, infrastructure, connectivity corridors, transport corridors, and so on and so forth, we have also new players in global geopolitics. So Europe will be also able to, let's say, if it put its act together, and it is currently in the state to be a significant geoeconomic actor. So if it develops this mindset also to become a geopolitical actor, and that means to solve the problem how and when to use hard power, at least in its direct vicinity, I argue that it could position itself as a key swing player in this vastly changing geopolitical arena, and then use the opportunity, for instance, with the Indo-Pacific to create this kind of connectivity corridors. We can discuss this later.
Okay, yeah, we will come to it later. I think I must confess I have been somewhat remiss in not imposing the time limit, but I think in the interest that all of you are joining in from different cities and we have an audience and they would also like to participate, I think we need to ensure that we keep the opening remarks as we had originally planned, short and brief. With that, let me turn to you, Dr. Lawrence.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. I will try to be brief, but these were all very interesting and very important introductory remarks by Linas and Velina, and I would only I could only reinforce them. But I would like to refer to the map that you showed at the very beginning, Mr. Ambassador, which very easily can support this Russian narrative that actually Russia felt threatened, so it had to respond and react to NATO enlargement. This is far from true, actually, because from the European perspective, it was quite clear that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we were ready to build partnership with Russia through European Union, through NATO. NATO has undergone a huge transformation from this Cold War alliance based on collective defense and deterrence to the tool that actually was adjusted to some crisis response mission and with a very limited capacity to perform this mission, which was clearly visible during the alliance engagement in Afghanistan, where European allies struggled with maintaining 50,000 strong force. The trends were in Europe, and this is the fact, most of the countries were cutting defense spending. Americans were withdrawing from Europe. Most of the countries were cutting investments in heavy armor and equipment necessary for collective defense, and no ammunition, no tanks, no artillery, or not in sufficient numbers that you could argue that Europeans, even with the limited support of the United States, would be able to defend themselves. So Russia was not provoked by NATO enlargement. It was rather encouraged by the signals that it received that neither United States nor major European powers had any vital interest in the post-Soviet space, and that NATO actually is not able to defend its own territory. So Russia calculated that the costs of first the aggression against Georgia will be limited, and it will send the signal that it has the right to have its own sphere of influence. Then it calculated, because of the response that was pretty weak and from international community, that annexation of Crimea will be met with acceptable costs, and it was not wrong. And then it calculated that if so, it is able to, and I want to reinforce what Velina said, that it is not about Ukraine only, it is about the whole European security architecture. This is why Russia in December 2021 put on the table this ultimatum to NATO and the United States, demanding the withdrawal of Western forces from Central and Eastern Europe. It demanded the legally binding treaties which would limit NATO the ability to send reinforcements here to the region. And then after framing the ultimatum, this is the nature of the ultimatum, so it was supposed to be rejected. Then only a couple of weeks later, it launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So it is not about some limited territorial gains in Ukraine. It is about total attempt of total subjugation of Ukraine. And at the same time, Russia, of course, threatened the alliance with the escalation. And it might be not visible for general public, but this aggressive nuclear rhetoric and threats of attacks against member EU and NATO member states supporting Ukraine, it was all about limiting the response, threatening the West with escalation. So we can see the response on the one hand that can be perceived as quite a robust, strong response of the US. But at the same time, and this is a very important point made by Velina, we still, there is no consensus what to do with Ukraine in the future. And some decision makers in the West say, oh, Russia already lost because it has not achieved its strategic goals. No, it is far from true. In 2 or 3 years' time, the war will probably continue, and Russia and Ukraine can be turned into a failed state. The costs of supporting Ukraine will be so huge. The public opinion in many European countries and in the US will get tired, and Russia in 3-5 years' time can achieve its strategic goals regarding Ukraine with huge negative consequences for the international community. But what it means very briefly to Poland's approach to strategic European strategic autonomy. First of all, in Poland, we believe that absolutely US leadership is indispensable, is absolutely necessary for Europe to be able to act in a decisive and timely manner. Then we also believe that we need to strengthen the European potential in many dimensions, but we rather should talk about, in terms of defense and deterrence, we should talk about European pillar in NATO, not in terms of European strategic autonomy. This European strategic autonomy, it creates the false impression that Europe would be able to defend itself. No, it would not. And of course, there are numerous areas where we can strengthen Europe, and we do not need to do it together with the United States. We should have Europe that is independent or more independent in many areas. We can use European funds to strengthen Europe, to strengthen European industrial base, to strengthen our space systems, to develop emerging and disruptive technologies, etc., etc. But we have to be realistic, and we need to understand that when we talk about European strategic autonomy, it is exactly what first Soviet Union and then Russia wanted, because it knew that Europe for the Europeans, Yankees go home. With all this rhetoric, actually Russia will be able to run its traditional policy based on spheres of influence and buffer zones, because countries, especially in Russian neighborhood or with strong relations with Russia, they will be able, it will be much more easier for Russia to influence those countries and make the divisions in Europe. And finally, 2 points. This approach to this concept of European strategic autonomy is not specifically Polish. This is not, or the eastern flank versus the West, because we can see also a number of very pro-Atlanticist countries in the West of Europe as well: Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, or some parts of German decision makers. So this is not the division between the eastern flank and countries further to the West. And I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lawrence. I think that was a very spirited intervention. Let me now turn to Dr. Speck. Dr. Speck, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for having me. And this was already very rich. And so I want just to add a few points. Can you hear me? Yeah. So first, about strategic autonomy, I think this was never meant, the idea was never meant to have Europe being able to defend itself against Russia. So the idea was always that the Russia issue or the Eastern problems have been kind of solved, and that there will be partnership with Russia. And so Macron came up with this idea that Europe should focus more on the South. North Africa, the Sahel. We had the French tried to Europeanize their approach to Mali. They brought the Europeans in. So it was very much looking towards the South. And this is where the French priority has been. And I would say has been. At the moment, we don't know, because they have been pushed out of the Sahel. But there's no real strategic reorientation so far from the French side. And all this was also strategic autonomy came up when Trump was US president. We had Macron, who was eager to put forward his vision of a united European defense, focused more on the South and be more independent of the US. At the moment when Trump was president and attacked NATO verbally, and so the Germans got very nervous, because traditionally they rely on American security. They feel completely at ease with the US as a security provider. In every moment in German history, from 1949, when the state was founded, to 1989, when we had 1990 unification, the US was always on Germany's side, was always very helpful and trusted Germany in those moments. So the US is really the big security partner, but then came Trump and really attacked the Germans as not doing enough and lazy and all kinds of things. So the Trump shock was very deep. So this was the picture before the Russian attack on Ukraine. But the Russian attack on Ukraine has changed everything, I would say, because you couldn't argue anymore that Russia is a partner. And I think that the idea of Russia as a partner the idea of Russia as a partner has really gone out of our debate. So what this war has demonstrated was that Russia remains a threat and that the US remains indispensable for European security. So nobody is arguing that in 4 or 5 years' time, Europe can defend itself against Russia. So the practicality is not there. So there is no clear path towards strategic autonomy on military grounds. And we also see today that the US is playing a leading role in European security, not just in terms of military support, where the US has always been first and the most important provider of arms to Ukraine, but also in terms of strategy. Without US leadership, there wouldn't be such a unified European approach to Ukraine. So what the Americans are doing is they build a coalition, pretty much as I would argue, as they do now in the Indo-Pacific as well, bringing the different parts together in different formats. That's what they do in Europe, and they were very successful in that. So Russia as a threat and US as an indispensable security provider. If Europe as a whole, West, East, North, South, has now accepted that Russia is a threat, it doesn't mean that they have the same view how to deal with this threat. The Central European view is clear, defense and deterrence. And the situation with Russia is defining a new era. It's not just a moment. It's not just that Putin has decided, has made a mistake and will reverse this mistake. This is what you can hear in Berlin or Paris. It's the view in Central Europe is that, and in Ukraine, of course, is that there is a hostility that will even grow. And the war in Ukraine, war against Ukraine, will even lead to Russia being more hostile towards Europe. So we have this view that we need more defense and deterrence. And then there's the other view. There's the other view that we can make a deal with Russia. And this is what we hear from Macron. And also, I would say the German Chancellor is sympathetic to this view, that the crisis can be solved by setting up a new European security architecture. So this is what is brewing in Europe. Those two camps are there. And what prevents them from dividing Europe is US leadership, because it's really the strategic leadership is driven by the White House. And in those meetings between Biden, Macron, Scholz, as the three most important, Sunak, sometimes Italy is also part of this group. This is really driving the Western strategy right now. So imagine Trump comes back, US leadership is gone on Ukraine, and then you suddenly have the two European camps, kind of starting to fight. You would have Macron standing up, trying to take on a leadership position with his vision of getting back to more of a partnership with Russia. He's always emphasizing that we need to sit at the table with Putin and then find out a joint solution. So this is what would very much come back. And then you have the Central Europeans very much. The Polish voice is very important, but the Czech voice as well. There are many, and we have the Scandinavians as well, who are in the, if you want, hawkish camp. Germany is in between. Germany, on the one hand, is very much connected to Ukraine, more than 1 million refugees. The Greens, many politicians are going to Ukraine regularly. There's a sense that this is also about our own security. The German security is as well at stake. But we have a chancellor who may not be totally convinced that this is the way ahead, that there is a path towards security with Russia. So at the moment, when you take US leadership away, you have different views, visions, agendas. And this is, I think, the problem that Europe has right now, is how to build leadership out of itself. Can the EU institutions overcome it? Certainly not. They are officials. Von der Leyen is doing a great job, but her role is limited. Who would step up? The Brits are pretty much out of the picture. They're really not very much involved in those debates, and they are very busy with their own Brexit problems. The Germans are reluctant to lead. They could, in theory, build a consensus between both camps because they are close to the Central Europeans, close to Ukraine, close to France as well. But I don't think that the current leadership is really willing to step up. So I think that's the biggest risk now, is that there's a change of leadership in the US, and then you suddenly have a Europe that has many different agendas and views. So I guess I stop here and looking forward to the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Speck. I think we have received a cross-section of views, and I get a sense that perhaps you have already posed certain points to which perhaps our other panelists, Dr. Lawrence and Madame Velina, are probably ready to take issue with you on those. But I don't think we will dominate. But I just wanted to ask one or two questions, and just pose it while we wait for questions to come into the chat box. One is that I know Linus, Mr. Kojala has left, but Ms. Velina Shakarova also made a similar point about the centrality of the Chinese US-China rivalry as the dominant rivalry, and you know, all of that. And so did Mr. Kojala. So let me just say that if both of you, I mean, if you, Ms. Velina, you sort of talked of the fact that European strategic autonomy is an artificial construct. Now, that's a very strong statement. I mean, it's a very bold and a very definitive, strong statement. But then, does it mean to say that Europe will join the US in its long-term strategic rivalry of the 21st century with China? And if that doesn't happen, then where is the togetherness? I mean, I have that particular question. The second thing is, and this, I again pose this because, and I would like to pose this to Dr. Speck, because I noticed from his bio that he works for something called a Zeitenwende Action Group. I mean, it was a term that was used by the German Chancellor. So is the Zeitenwende something that is restricted to Europe, or is it a Zeitenwende for the rest of the world? Now, if it is something that is for the rest of the world, then, you know, then there is a whole different ballgame. Then we are looking at a major 21st century reordering, as it were. Or is it going to be restricted? I mean, even now, so far, yes, NATO is there as a proxy actor. The huge monetary NATO and European Union. I mean, I'm told that it is, if 100 billion of military assistance has gone in, about 50 to 60 billion of economic and reconstruction assistance has gone in to keep the power stations running and all the rest of it. So that's a huge amount of money. So, I mean, is the attempt to just keep it limited so that it doesn't become Zeitenwende for the rest of the world? And to Dr. Lawrence, I would just say that it is, you know, you said that you tried to say that, well, I was trying to, the picture that I showed was something that should not have made Russia nervous. And, but the fact is that, I mean, NATO's military expenditure, you can say that countries were bringing their military expenditures down. But the fact is that NATO still was spending the largest amount in terms of defense expenditures. In fact, and this is the whole point. In 2022, you had a $1.1 trillion expenditure of NATO member states, out of which 750 billion was United States by itself, and the rest of the 29 countries made up the balance. And so, I mean, And as President Zelensky himself made, I think it was he who made this wonderful statement. He says, NATO's waiting room is the most dangerous place. I thought that he was referring to the 2007 Bucharest summit statement, which gave a green light to Georgia and Ukraine's admission. So that's something for you to look on. And perhaps we can start with you, Madam Shakarova, and then we go to Dr. Speck, and then we end up with Dr. Lawrence. And by that time, we'll have some more questions coming into the chat box.
Thank you, Ambassador, for a very provocative question. In fact, you couldn't ask a better question to someone like me who has been dealing with exactly this kind of question for at least the last 10 years, where one of my main theses regarding the global system shifts has been since at least the time when Xi Jinping came to power, and then this kind of very interesting and pretty much overlooked modus vivendi of coordination between China and Russia started happening. I can assure you that almost nobody was paying attention, even though that now everybody is talking about it as the most obvious thing that has happened and occurred in global affairs. And one of my main theses was centered around the idea that what we are going to observe is not a new bipolarity as we've seen it in the during the time of the Cold War, and it's not going to be the multipolarity that the majority of the experts were claiming, because all of this multipolarity is more or less taking place at regional level, at the various centers of power in the different regions and corners of the world. But in fact, it's going to be a bifurcation of the global system, a global system that has produced itself out of an immense and very successful globalization over the last 30 years, securitized, facilitated obviously by a hegemonic power such as the United States, which is still the only state actor with global power projections capabilities. And in fact, what we are now seeing is this bifurcation that means a split of a system that has connected itself in every important socioeconomic network, from trade and economic affairs to energy, agriculture, commodities markets, and every other significant network, where right now the opposite trend of entanglement is happening. And it is happening not just as a decoupling, what everyone hears, but it is happening to the point that we are seeing the emergence of regional structures, organizations. We are seeing erosion of international organizations, international legal frameworks under the guidance of the one power, where the other power, obviously China, is trying also to present its own version, its interpretation of global norms, its benchmark in terms of partnerships, and so on and so forth. So it's a big topic. But I needed to say a little bit about this bifurcation, because what I argue may happen, I'm not saying it's happening in Europe, but it may happen for the very same reason how actually, and it was pointed out by my colleague, my German colleague, and by the other colleagues as well, when it comes to the approach to Russia, may happen also in Europe when it comes to the approach to China. We are already observing, and I wouldn't say this is a division. I wouldn't define this as a dividing line. I would argue that this global system bifurcation that is happening simultaneously in all relevant networks is going to induce a bifurcation of Europe because of the systemic rivalry, where we will see very clear dividing line between those European powers that are going to see their security being guaranteed first and foremost by the United States, not by an artificial construct, as I said, which is called strategic autonomy, or it's called common security and defense policy. We love in Brussels and in Europe, we love to work with abbreviations that nobody else understands. But they are going to see their security only and solely guaranteed by the United States, and by extension NATO, but first and foremost by United States. So having this approach to China, they're going to follow suit And this is where, you know, continental powers, the big players that are determining also the future of the continent when it comes to industrial policy, economic policy, and so on and so forth. Think of France, Germany, which are now struggling to come up with a new idea how to deal with China, which is this, sorry, I don't want to be cynical, but now we've come up with the idea of de-risking our relationship with China, which I argue is going to backfire the very same way how we come up with the idea of Wandel durch Handel, namely to create such an interdependence with Russia that Russia would have zero incentive to actually strike against Europe. This was the mindset. So right now we are going to de-risk, we are not going to decouple. So we are going to de-risk in some policies, and this is not going to be acceptable in the long run. This is my main thesis. So it will produce a kind of systemic processes, not deliberate dividing line. It's not going to, you're not going to hear by political leaders that, oh, we are divided on the topic of China. But you think of the industrial establishment, think of the economic dependencies. You know, you have German industries that are dependent on this relationship with China. So it's going to be very difficult.
But then this is bound to create or show up at least differences within Europe vis-a-vis what the US may expect of it in its rivalry.
Absolutely.
Okay. So let me end that and turn to Dr. Speck.
Yeah, I can just continue here. So Europe is, I mean, I would say Zeitenwende. Nobody knows what Zeitenwende is. I think so we have the Cold War paradigm, and then we have the post-Cold War paradigm, which was globalization and the disappearance of great power, competition, and threats. And everybody thought that Russia and China, as the main competitors of the West during the Cold War, would kind of move over to our camp. And this just hasn't happened. They became very rich. And now they are very scared of importing too much from us. Democracy, liberal values, a rule of law. And we saw this in Russia and China. They have internal unrest, the elections in Russia, 2012, so on. And in China, you also see this with Hong Kong. So they are trying to, I would say, go so far as to what they want to do now is to make the world safe for autocracy, as opposed to the big Wilsonian project. And they think we are on the decline. They think the US is on decline. Putin just said it again. The Europeans don't matter. I think this is also the Chinese view of Europe, that we can be bought. Europeans are dependent. The solar panel questions, and now the e-car question. So they think they are winning, basically. And then we have the declaration, the Russian-Chinese declaration of February 22, where they, you know, the whole declaration was about democracy. And the main point they made in the first 20 paragraphs was, we have our own democracy. And both are very scared to lose power, because with a liberal economy, you know, you have new centers of powers emerging. This is what happened. Alibaba in China, in Russia, it's well known. So the security people take over. Regime security is the #1 priority. It's more important than prosperity. So the Chinese and the Russians, the ticket of those regimes was prosperity. And now they move over to security. And this means also confrontation with the West. Regional confrontation, as you know much better than we Europeans, but we also follow that. And I think a country that has really went through a Zeitenwende was Japan. I think Abe and now Kishida, they look at this world in strategic terms. They make the link. There was this one day when she was in Moscow, Kishida was in Kiev. So the Japanese really link the two theaters, and they think of it as two theaters of the same struggle. Of course, there's also a little bit of give and take. If we help you Europeans, and we see the Koreans also support Ukraine now with, I think, several billions. So, of course, there's also a give and take. You help us with China, we help you with Russia. But there's also, I think, and if you read Kishida's speeches, is always an acknowledgement that this is the same struggle. And it's the US that is organizing those coalitions. And you had Modi in Washington pretty much saying that as well. And I think India made also a move in this direction. So what I see is an emergence of European alliances, Asian alliances, those countries coming together, the G20 summit in India right now. I think we see coalitions of countries that don't want to be hostile to Russia and China, but they are forced into defending the order we have, call it rules-based order, liberal international order. And so we see countries moving in this camp. Korea recently, Australia since a long time, India, the Philippines, they made a clear choice. They stand up now more to China. And in Europe, you have countries like Poland, the Baltic countries, the Scandinavians. So we have a strong alliance of countries who are supporting this. And I think the Biden administration is very smart in managing this without really getting too aggressive in their approach. And then you have countries that are, insecure where they want to go or whether they really have to get into this kind of struggle with Russia and China. You have Indonesia in Asia, but I think in Asia, the picture is clearer than in Europe. In Europe, you have France, Italy, Spain, Germany is also kind of in between. So those countries are not yet sure whether it's heightened when that means that they have to invest in their defense budgets, that they have to de-link from or decouple in some regards from China. And they want to, and you see this very much in Macron, who traveled to China and produced this wonderful clip where he fell obviously in love with the country. And so he thinks he can manage a non-hostile relationship.
Okay. So in other words, we are not certain, all of Europe is not yet certain that there is a Zeitenwende. As you said, you named 4 countries, you named Spain, you named Italy, you named France, and you said, think perhaps Germany.
Right.
This is exactly the definition of old Europe. But anyway, I mean, let me...
The Dutch are much better.
Yes, the Dutch, but a smaller country. So, but with that, Dr. Lawrence, I mean, you heard something. If you would like to respond to something, and then we already have some questions which I will be posing to all of you.
Yeah, very, very briefly about what you said about this invitation to Georgia and Ukraine to NATO, actually in 2008.
The waiting room, the dangerous waiting room.
The waiting room. But actually, in 2007, after this very aggressive Putin speech in Munich conference, where he already demonstrated what are his plans and goals regarding the sphere of influence and the buffer zone in Central and Eastern Europe. And then we had this Bucharest summit of NATO in 2008, and there was there were very deep divisions among the allies. Some of them wanted to, after this Putin speech, wanted to offer Ukraine and Georgia a clear pathway to NATO, and others said that it would be too provocative and it will provoke Russia. So just to cover those divisions, the compromise was reached that, okay, so we will adopt this political non-binding declaration that Georgia and
that is
Ukraine
known. I think we know that.
Yes, but of course this is still used as an argument that Russia was provoked, and actually I still claim that Russia was encouraged, not provoked, by NATO enlargement, by encouraged by lack of determination to defend the strategic interests in Eastern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe. So this is the first point. And regarding China, of course, it will be absolutely fundamental that Europe is able to coordinate to some extent with the United States. its policies. It does not need to be a very close cooperation, because in some areas, for example, we have our own European interests, like the protection of data, for example. But when we protect data according to our values and standards, then it is per se in coordination with the United States, because they have a similar approach. They want to have not to be susceptible to the influence from China. So this is one example. In many areas, we will strengthen ourselves. We will strengthen our sovereignty or strategic autonomy, whatever we call it. Although I prefer not to use this this latter term. And we will. By doing so, we will be able to strengthen a rules-based international order, and we limit the risk that if there is a conflict in the Indo-Pacific, that China will intimidate the European countries, so they will be unable to respond. So I can see that Europe can be, between China and the United States, but still in terms of values and interests, it is and should be the ally of the United States, and it cannot keep the equal distance from China and the United States. In many areas, this distance will be much closer to the United States.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you're right when you say that it cannot be equidistant from the US, and that Europe cannot be equidistant from US and China because it is much closer to the US. But then you also added that to some extent we will have our own independent space vis-a-vis China. And I think that is where the balance, that's like the Goldilocks story. You have to find the right balance, not too hot, not too cold, just right. But anyway, I think we have some interesting questions in the chat box. And let me take a couple of them first. And you don't have to answer all of them. You can pick and choose whatever you like to think is interesting from your point of view. Will the de-dollarization movement play a part in the US involvement in the Ukraine-Russia war? I mean, de-dollarization movement, I thought, is more relevant to the US-China rivalry, and the Chinese trying to get out of they're the ones who are creating the de-dollarization. So it's not very clear as to how this is relevant to the Ukraine-Russia war. There's another question which says, do you think that the United Nations can or should play a role in this situation? There's another question, a third question that I'll take up at the same time, which is that that the relationship between US and Europe has been built over trust. But then similarly, Russia has also built relationships over trust with many countries, including India and many African and Latin American countries. And so therefore, the question of bringing in that supporting Russia is moral or immoral or justified or unjustified. How is that? I mean, it talks of the assurance to Gorbachev about not 1 inch, about NATO expansion. But I think we heard a very spirited defense on that by Dr. Lawrence. So let me just stop here and I'll take the next set of questions after you had a go at these. Anybody can take any which one. I mean, I'm not going to allocate them individually to you. Yeah, please, Dr. Speck.
Yeah, I think, on trust, my country, Germany, has tried to work with Russia based on trust for many years. And so Schröder is well known as someone who has too much trusted Putin. So he became his, how to call it, a paid advisor. But Merkel really tried to get more distant with Putin, but still keep this relationship going as a partnership. Merkel half of Merkel was, I think, was the sensibility of the Central Europeans, and because she became West German or a German citizen only at the age of 36. Before she was closer to, I would say, in mindset and experience with the Central Europeans. But then she tried to balance this relationship between I would say, a Western European and a Central European approach. But then at the end of the day, she was more in the Western European approach camp. But she was very outspoken, Pussy Riot, all these kind of domestic protests. But where she really, I mean, I wouldn't say broke with Putin, but where this relationship really got very, very off track was when Putin brought his little green man to Crimea and told her over the phone that Russia is not involved in anything of that. And so this is seen by some observers as the moment where she really, and then later on she said to Obama, he's really living in another world. And I think the trust relationship, and also then after that, even Macron tried to build a relationship based on trust. He invited Putin, really the red floor. He tried to bring him back to the G7, and so on, so on. So we have, you know, a huge number. Also, all the American presidents who had their reset moments with Putin. And what they all experienced is that you cannot trust this guy because, well, he's KGB, he is following other, you know, he's just using people. So I think the trust relation has gone totally. And that's why we also argue that there can be no negotiations with Russia that are not based on a balance of power, a balance of military power, position of strength, because otherwise we cannot give Russia something based on promises. We had the whole, after 2013, the whole process of negotiations with Russia. And even before February 23, the French and the Germans were negotiating with the Russians. It's 20 years of experience with Putin, who is lying people straight in the face. And it's just reversing course. So I think this is just, I understand the Indian case is very different, but I also think the Indian case is based on a difficult security situation in the north of your country, and another history during the Cold War and distrust of the
which is also true for a lot of African countries and Latin American countries, I guess. And you know, one can quite see the European dilemma in that sense is a far greater dilemma, and which is why I think the answer that we heard from you people about what Japan is doing, and you know, you mentioned about Japan's efforts and South Korea's efforts to get closer to Europe and sort of say that, look, if this is our concern and this is your concern, but if we see your concern, then you should see our concern. I thought that was a very useful kind of a comment. But does anybody want to comment on a role for the United Nations?
I can say a few things about the UN and about the question of the de-dollarization, because there is a link also. In fact, I think that it's a very, very good question that was posed. UN is international organization where, in fact, I've written an analysis on the Security Council, where we clearly see how it has been split between two key blocks of permanent members. And of course, obviously, all the non-permanent members are also being dragged into this kind of competition. And of course, one of the key revelations that we've seen of this kind of bifurcation, again, China, Russia on the one side, obviously United States, France, Great Britain on the other, UK on the other, and then we had, like, from the beginning of the war, all the failed efforts within the Security Council. But yet the General Assembly is such an example where United Nations played a role. since the beginning of the war, where we saw that even partners of Russia, in fact, voted in favor of Ukraine. This was a big, let's say, diplomatic breakthrough. But we also saw how, in fact, certain dependencies could be successfully instrumentalized, and this is going to be the era of instrumentalization of this kind of dependencies on raw materials, on commodities, because of what I explained, or at least tried to shortly explain to you, of the detrimental process of disentanglement between, two forces that have worked together for more than 50 years. So the General Assembly is such an example. Right now, the biggest UN Court of Justice, the most important organization, is going to allow 32 nations, I think, to present their their cases on the topic of genocide. I think that this is a very important also for the general case of what's happening in Ukraine, and United Nations once again provides the required platform for these hearings coming from 32 countries. Now, speaking of the de-dollarization, obviously what Russia is trying here is of course linked also to the idea that the US reserve currency is no longer serving the interests not only of Russia, but let's say of many other players. And of course they try to present this narrative together with China at the silver plate for the global south. So in a sense that not so much because of weakness of the dollar, but in fact because of the strength of the dollar, because in times of crises, like we've seen during the pandemic and post-pandemic, and now with the war and the inflationary effects of the war, and you, Ambassador, has also mentioned that there are already global ramifications. Well, one of these global ramifications is very much linked to also to currencies. And here we've seen this with the BRICS summit. We will see this also in the future, that there will be efforts towards creating mechanisms of, let's say, trading with national currencies, but also probably there will be an effort towards BRICS currency, maybe linked to the gold, maybe linked to a third currency. Right now, for instance, I can assure you, because I've been following this very closely in the trade volume between Russia and India, but also between Russia and China when it comes to commodities, specifically energy commodities, that there are already indeed
Let me just tell
trade
you
volumes.
Let me just tell you there will not be a BRICS currency for the very simple reason that in the entire BRICS, just see the size of the Chinese economy compared to the others. So there is no way that there is ever, I mean, it's,
I agree with you. I just wanted to
impossible.
point to the trend. I agree with you. I also agree absolutely with you that I don't think that there will be a BRICS currency. I'm just pointing to the current trends, what is being discussed. But what we are observing is a growing volume, trade volume actually conducted in national currencies. And even in the trade volume between India and Russia, when it comes to the oil trade, some of the share has been conducted in yuan, in Chinese yuan, because of the sanctions, because it's very difficult to, in fact, conduct these, payments in US dollars. So this is going to happen, and it doesn't, for instance, serve the Indian interest. So obviously it's not going to be the Chinese yuan, but it will be the rupee, or maybe it will be the currency
UAE
of the United
dirham
Emirates. Exactly. Yeah. So the point here is that this all flows into the same direction, and the trend projection is in fact pointing to a de-dollarization efforts by this country. So I argue that the next probably 2-3 years will be quite critical to give us a sense and a picture in which direction this trend goes.
Okay. Dr. Lawrence, you want to take up any of the issues?
Yes, very briefly on 3 issues. Thank you very much for very good, interesting questions to all the participants. First of all, about the sanctions that impacted also many developing countries. So it is absolutely fundamental to stress that EU sanctions explicitly exclude food, grain, fertilizers, sanctions on Russia. At the same time, Russia is attacking Ukrainian infrastructure, trying to block Ukraine from exporting food to the world market. So This is rather Russia contributing to misery of developing countries and not the Western or European Union sanctions on Russia. The issue of trust and this not an inch to the West. It is probably better to look to what Gorbachev said himself, and there is a number of interviews with former president of Russia, first president after the Cold War, who said that it was not about NATO enlargement. Nobody discussed NATO enlargement at that time. It was about the eastern part of Germany that was to become the part of the new unified Germany. And in this new treaty, there was the provision that actually stated that no new infrastructure, NATO infrastructure, will be developed in the eastern part of Germany. And the third issue, very good question about the Polish and French cooperation, that it is fundamentally important for European defense. I think that it reflects two different visions, two countries. That one is more focused on the West, like France, and Poland, that is more focused on the threats coming from the East. So when you are able to reconcile those two different threat perceptions, when you are able to, when Poland is able to strengthen cooperation with France and benefit also from the French nuclear deterrent, and when France is able to strengthen cooperation with Poland, so Poland and other countries of the region are able to support the ability of the EU to stabilize southern neighborhood to bigger extent, then we will definitely see much stronger Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think although you answered the issue of the sanctions, particularly, and you made a distinction between European sanctions and US sanctions, but the fact is that the US sanctions are far stronger in that sense. And we just saw even yesterday, the US has sanctioned 150 entities in Russia, in UAE, and other countries put together, in Turkey, where they think that there have been, because of the fact that some of the critical components continue to find their way through Armenia or through Georgia or through Turkey or through other countries or through transshipments through UAE to Russia. So, I mean, what we are seeing is a weaponization of the fact that the US has the capacity to bring about unilateral sanctions and make them pinch. You know, let's say, essentially it is that weapon, and there is no other country today that has that kind of a weapon. I mean, even Europe, if they could come together with overcome all their internal differences, it still would not have that, could use that as a weapon as effectively. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I definitely agree that there is some backlash from the sanctions, but we are talking mainly about, you can see the reaction of the so-called developing countries or African countries. They reacted strongly to the risk of the food crisis, not to the backlash, you know, of different sorts of sanctions, the attempts to make it impossible for third countries to, you know, to benefit from getting round of the sanctions. These are, of course, all important issues, and it can hit some countries. But the biggest issue is the risk of the food crisis, and how actually Russia tries to use it to exert pressure on Ukraine and on the you know, the so-called global South, to also exert pressure on European Union, NATO countries, so they exert pressure on Russia on Ukraine to stop fighting, to make it blunt. So and we have to be clear about this, that this is Russia that contributes to this risk of the food crisis, because Ukraine wants to export its grain to the world markets, and this is Russia that tries to destroy this capacity. And European sanctions do not in any way influence Russian ability
No, I
to
think
export food.
we are clear on that, but I think that we also know that it has now been stated by the United Nations that out of the food grains that were exported under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, 41% went to the developed world. So it is quite clear, and that it doesn't all go to the poorest of the poor countries. There's a specific question for Dr. Lawrence, which says that Pierre Haroche writes that the future of European defense depends on the French-Polish couple.
Yeah, I already addressed this question. Yes.
All right. Okay. So I think we are also come to the end of our time here, and I think we have covered all the questions in some fashion or the other. So all that remains for me is to thank you for a very, very enlightening conversation. And I think it is quite clear that these are not simple issues. And the fact that, as I said right at the beginning, that most panel discussions about Ukraine focus on who is winning, who is losing, how does the war end, what will be whose victory, etc., etc. But in my experience as a diplomat, having negotiated in different kinds of conflict situations as well, a negotiated outcome can only be a sustainable outcome if it is seen as a win-win outcome, by definition. In any negotiation, if you want an outcome to emerge out of negotiations, then both sides have to find some gain in it. You cannot say that this guy wins and this guy loses, and that is a negotiated outcome, because they will never accept it as such. It has to be seen by both sides as a win-win outcome. The fact that today we don't see that is that we don't really know what a win-win outcome is. And that is perhaps why we don't see any attempts, even though there were some attempts very early on by Turkey when the conflict began to find some way out. But today, we don't really see any meaningful negotiations, because the idea of a negotiated outcome does not fall within the parameters as a sustainable outcome. And I think that is something that came out very clearly in what was said by Dr. Lawrence, by you, as well as by you, Dr. Speck. I'm sorry we lost Mr. Kojala early on in our session, but I'm sure that we have had a wonderful conversation, and I should hand the floor back to you, Rushali. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Sood. A very big thank you to all our panelists. And I think I speak on behalf of all the audience members here as well. It was extremely informative, and you've got some very, very interesting insights. And I think the hallmark of this discussion is that it's given us more to think about and really reflect upon. So thank you very much. I take this opportunity to also thank CAS for organizing this webinar. We're very excited for the next, which are up to follow as a part of the series. I would request all audience members also to stay tuned and follow our social media channels, where we will be updating information on this. So once again, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience members as well, who presented some very, very interesting questions. So yes, thank you once again. And a special thank you to Ambassador Sood for such a wonderfully moderated discussion. Yeah, so with that, I think I'll bring a webinar to the close now. We will be sharing the recording of the same on our YouTube channel and as well as on our websites. So thank you once again. And thank you very much to our panelists. We will stay in touch with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you. Thank you very much.